The torpedo track was perfect. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton watched through USS Wahoo's periscope as the white wake streaked toward the Japanese destroyer at exactly 90 degrees, a textbook shot at 800 yards. The crew held their breath in the cramped control room, counting seconds until impact. The torpedo struck the destroyer amidships with a dull thud that echoed through the submarine's hull. And nothing happened. The Japanese destroyer didn't explode, it didn't slow, it didn't even appear damaged. Instead, it turned directly toward Wahoo, increasing speed, its crew clearly seeing the periscope, or the torpedo wake. Morton slammed the periscope handles up and barked orders for a crash dive as depth charges began dropping around them. In the chaos of the emergency dive, with explosions shaking the submarine and light bulbs shattering, one thought dominated Morton's mind. The torpedo had worked perfectly, except for the part where it was supposed to explode. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Topside, Japanese sailors were already radiating their assessment back to headquarters. The American torpedoes were defective, unreliable, perhaps even deliberately sabotaged by incompetent American workers. This wasn't an isolated incident, but confirmation of a pattern Japanese naval intelligence had been tracking since December 1941. American submarines kept missing or achieving hits that didn't detonate. The conclusion seemed obvious. America's vaunted industrial capacity had produced a weapon that simply didn't work. The Japanese weren't entirely wrong. What they didn't understand was that American submarine commanders were reaching the same conclusion, and unlike the Japanese, they had the institutional capacity to eventually fix the problem. When they did, 1,314 Japanese ships would discover exactly how effective American torpedoes could be. But that reckoning was still 3 years away, and the path from failure to devastating success would be fought not just against the Japanese Empire, but against America's own Bureau of Ordnance. The Mark 14 torpedo represented 20 years of American engineering, developed during the interwar period when budget constraints and treaty limitations dominated naval thinking. The weapon was sophisticated, perhaps too sophisticated. It measured 20 feet and 6 inches long, weighed 3,200 pounds, and carried a 663-pound Torpex warhead that was theoretically powerful enough to break a ship's keel with a single hit. The Mark 14 was designed to run beneath a target ship and detonate via magnetic influence exploder. The theory was brilliant. Instead of hitting the armored side of a ship where thick steel belt plating could absorb the blast, the torpedo would pass underneath and detonate beneath the keel, where the magnetic field was strongest. The underwater explosion would create a gas bubble that would lift the ship, then collapse, breaking the keel. One torpedo, one kill. The ship would snap in half and sink within minutes. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was a disaster built on 3 fundamental, catastrophic flaws that would take 2 years of combat to fully identify and another year to completely fix. The first problem was depth control. The Mark 14 was supposed to run at a preset depth, typically 10 feet, shallow enough to pass beneath a target ship's keel, but deep enough to avoid surface detection. The depth mechanism used a pressure-sensitive valve connected to the torpedo's hydroplanes. As water pressure increased, the valve adjusted the hydroplanes to maintain constant depth. Simple, elegant, and in actual combat conditions, completely unreliable. The torpedo ran 10 to 12 feet deeper than set. A torpedo set to run at 10 feet actually ran at 20 to 22 feet, passing harmlessly beneath targets that drew only 15 or 20 feet of water. Submarine commanders reported perfect attacks on targets that should have been hit, only to watch ships sail away untouched. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the depth mechanism worked perfectly because it had been tested and proven in peacetime trials. What the Bureau didn't account for was that peacetime testing used exercise torpedoes without warheads. A 21-inch diameter torpedo traveling at 46 knots creates a pressure wave ahead of it that affects the depth sensor readings. Remove 663 pounds of warhead from the nose, and the torpedo's balance shifts, changing how it interacts with that pressure wave. The exercise torpedoes ran at the correct depth. The combat torpedoes, heavier in the nose, ran deep. The Bureau had tested one configuration and deployed another, never recognizing the difference mattered. The second problem was the contact exploder. Even when the magnetic exploder was turned off and the torpedo was set to run shallow for direct contact hits, the Mark VI contact exploder frequently failed to detonate on impact. The device used a firing pin mechanism that required the torpedo to hit at a precise angle roughly perpendicular to the target. Hit at too oblique an angle, and the firing pin would not strike with enough force. Hit too directly, and the firing pin would jam. This wasn't a theoretical problem, it was a mechanical certainty. The Mark VI exploder had been designed before anyone had combat data on actual impact angles. Peacetime testing used stationary targets or carefully controlled impact scenarios. Real combat involved hitting moving targets at various angles, often while the submarine was maneuvering violently to avoid counterattack. The range of angles that would produce reliable detonation was far narrower than the range of angles that actual combat produced. Submarine commanders reported hearing their torpedoes strike targets, the unmistakable clang of steel on steel, echoing through the water, transmitted back to the submarine through the ocean. The crews would celebrate, certain of a hit. Then periscope observation would reveal the target still afloat, still moving, sometimes not even appearing damaged. The torpedo had struck, but failed to explode. Japanese damage control crews would later find American torpedoes lodged in their hulls, unexploded, their firing pins jammed or bent. The third problem was the magnetic exploder itself, the Mark VI's secret feature that was supposed to give American submarines a decisive advantage. The magnetic exploder used sensors that detected changes in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a ship's steel hull. When the torpedo passed through this magnetic anomaly, the exploder would trigger detonation even without physical contact. Except, the Earth's magnetic field isn't uniform. It varies by latitude, by local geology, by the magnetic properties of ocean currents carrying different mineral concentrations. The magnetic exploder had been calibrated for the magnetic field strength in the North Atlantic and Caribbean, where testing had occurred. But American submarines in the Pacific were operating in completely different magnetic environments. The magnetic field near Japan was different from the field near the Philippines, which was different from the field near Australia. Torpedoes detonated prematurely, exploding hundreds of yards before reaching targets because the magnetic sensors triggered on field variations that had nothing to do with enemy ships. Or they didn't detonate at all because the local field strength was too weak to trigger the mechanism even when passing directly beneath a target. The magnetic exploder was trying to sense tiny variations in a baseline field that kept changing, like trying to hear a whisper in a room where the background noise randomly fluctuates from silence to roaring. Most damningly, the magnetic exploder was classified. Security regulations prohibited testing it with live warheads because doing so would risk compromising the secret mechanism. The peacetime tests that supposedly validated the design used dummy exploders or simulated conditions. Nobody had ever detonated a torpedo with a live magnetic exploder beneath an actual ship's hull in realistic combat conditions before the war started. The weapon went from theoretical success directly to combat deployment, and only then did its failures become apparent. By mid-1942, submarine commanders throughout the Pacific were reporting consistent torpedo failures. The patrol reports piled up at submarine force headquarters in Pearl Harbor and Brisbane. Commander after commander described perfect attacks that produced no results. They reported torpedoes running beneath targets, torpedoes striking without exploding, torpedoes detonating prematurely. The pattern was undeniable to anyone reading the reports objectively. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington was not reading them objectively. Rear Admiral William Blandy, chief of the Bureau's Ordnance Development Division, defended the Mark XIV with institutional ferocity. The torpedo had been tested extensively. The problems, if they existed, must be due to operator error, poor maintenance, or combat conditions that invalidated the test parameters. Submarine commanders were attacking at incorrect angles, miscalculating target speed, failing to maintain proper depth control on their boats during attacks. The weapon was sound. The operators were the problem. This position wasn't entirely irrational from the Bureau's perspective. The Mark 14 torpedo development program had consumed 2 decades and enormous resources. Admitting fundamental flaws meant admitting that peacetime testing protocols were inadequate, that security classifications had prevented proper validation, that the Navy had gone to war with a weapon that didn't work. The institutional cost of that admission was higher than most officers were willing to pay. So the Bureau doubled down. When submarine commanders requested permission to conduct their own tests, permission was denied or granted with limitations that prevented meaningful results. When some commanders deactivated the magnetic exploder on their own authority, they were reprimanded for violating procedure. The official line remained consistent. The torpedo works. Learn to use it properly. Commander Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, was caught between his frustrated submarine skippers and the intransigent Bureau. Lockwood was a career submariner who understood his commanders weren't incompetent. He'd read the patrol reports. He'd heard the sonar recordings of torpedoes striking targets without detonating. He believed his men. But he also understood naval hierarchy and the political reality that directly contradicting the Bureau of Ordnance could end his career. Lockwood chose persistence over confrontation. He began documenting every torpedo failure in meticulous detail, building an evidence file that would eventually become irrefutable. He authorized informal tests when he could justify them under existing regulations. Most importantly, he protected submarine commanders who were experimenting with solutions, providing them bureaucratic cover when Washington objected. In Australia, the situation was even more urgent. The submarines operating from Brisbane were hunting Japanese supply lines in waters where the magnetic field variations were most extreme. Their torpedo failures were more frequent and more catastrophic. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton's experience aboard Wahoo wasn't unique. It was typical. Submarine after submarine returned from patrol having fired dozens of torpedoes at confirmed targets and achieved minimal results. The frustration was compounded by the strategic situation. American submarines were the only force consistently operating in Japanese-controlled waters during 1942. They were supposed to be strangling Japan's supply lines, sinking the tankers and freighters that sustained the Japanese Empire's far-flung conquests. Instead, they were expending torpedoes on attacks that produced nothing but Japanese mockery and American casualties when counterattacks found them. By mid-1942, Japanese naval intelligence had established clear patterns. American submarines were dangerous in terms of their ability to reach targets. Their commanders showed aggressive instincts, but their primary weapon was unreliable. Japanese convoy commanders learned to be more concerned about American mines and aircraft than submarines. The underwater threat existed, but it was manageable. The defective torpedoes had neutralized what should have been the most dangerous weapon in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage didn't have permission for what he was about to do. He was commanding USS Trout on patrol off Midway in June 1942, and he'd just returned from firing 8 torpedoes at Japanese ships and scoring 0 hits, despite what his crew swore were perfect attacks. Ramage had been a torpedo officer before taking command. He understood the weapon's mechanics better than most, and he was convinced the depth control mechanism was defective. So he conducted an unauthorized test. He set a torpedo to run at 10 feet depth and fired it at a sea cliff on Midway's north shore at low tide, where he could observe the impact point. The torpedo struck 15 feet below the waterline. He fired another set to 10 feet. It hit at 23 feet below the waterline. The depth error wasn't slight or occasional. It was consistent and catastrophic. Ramage radioed his findings to Pearl Harbor, including the precise depth measurements and his recommendation that all torpedoes should be set to run 9 to 10 feet shallower than the desired depth to compensate for the mechanical error. The report went to Commander Lockwood, who now had empirical data to support what his submarine commanders had been reporting anecdotally. Lockwood ordered his own tests. In late June and early July 1942, submarines at Pearl Harbor conducted systematic depth tests, firing torpedoes with disabled warheads at nets set at measured depths. The results confirmed Ramage's findings. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet consistently ran at 21 to 22 feet. The depth mechanism wasn't maintaining preset depth. It was adding 11 feet of error. Lockwood sent the data to the Bureau of Ordnance with a formal recommendation that all submarine commanders be authorized to set torpedoes 11 feet shallower than their desired running depth until the mechanism could be recalibrated. The Bureau's response was skeptical but pragmatic. They didn't admit the design was flawed, instead suggesting that local conditions might be producing anomalous results that required field adjustments. But they authorized Lockwood's depth correction procedure. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By August 1942, American submarines in the Pacific were running their torpedoes with the 11-foot depth correction. Hit rates improved immediately. Submarine commanders who'd been firing dozens of torpedoes with minimal results suddenly began reporting consistent impacts. Ships that would have been passed beneath by torpedoes running too deep were now being hit. The depth problem was solved, or more accurately, worked around through field modification that compensated for a design flaw the Bureau still wouldn't formally acknowledge. But solving the depth problem revealed the contact exploder problem more clearly. Now that torpedoes were hitting targets consistently, submarine commanders discovered their torpedoes were striking ships and not exploding at a rate that couldn't be explained by bad luck. Perfect hits, confirmed by sound operators and periscope observation, producing metallic clangs but no explosions. Ships sailing away with American torpedoes lodged in their hulls. Commander Morton aboard Wahoo became obsessed with the problem. In January 1943, during a patrol that would make him legendary, Morton attacked a Japanese convoy with his usual aggressive tactics. He closed to point-blank range, under 2,000 yards, removing any possibility of fire control error. He fired 9 torpedoes at 3 different ships, all hits confirmed by sound and observation. 3 exploded. 6 struck and failed to detonate. Morton returned to Pearl Harbor furious. He went directly to Lockwood's office and demanded permission to test the contact exploder. Lockwood, now armed with the success of the depth correction, and increasingly confident in challenging the Bureau, authorized it. Morton and his crew conducted tests by firing torpedoes at varying angles against cliffs in the Hawaiian Islands, where they could recover the weapons and examine the exploders. They discovered the firing pin problem. When the torpedo struck at a perpendicular angle, the impact compressed the firing pin housing, jamming the pin before it could strike the primer. When it struck at an oblique angle, below about 45 degrees, the pin didn't strike with enough force to ignite the primer. The tolerance range for reliable detonation was far narrower than combat conditions produced. The fix was embarrassingly simple: lighten the firing pin mechanism, strengthen the spring, increase the primer sensitivity. These weren't sophisticated engineering challenges, they were basic mechanical adjustments that could be made in a machine shop. Submarine tenders in Pearl Harbor began modifying exploders using Morton's specifications. The Bureau of Ordnance, presented with clear evidence of mechanical failure, finally authorized official modifications in September 1943. But there was still the magnetic exploder, and this problem would prove more resistant to field solutions because the Bureau had invested too much institutional prestige in the device to abandon it easily. The magnetic exploder problem came to a head in June 1943 during a series of attacks that should have been submarine warfare's finest moment, but instead became its most frustrating failure. Commander John Cromwell led a coordinated submarine attack on a Japanese convoy carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Truk, the major Japanese base in the Caroline Islands. Intelligence had provided excellent information on the convoy's composition, speed, and route. 6 submarines were positioned for a devastating ambush. The submarines achieved perfect positioning. They fired over 40 torpedoes at close range against large, slow-moving targets. They scored numerous hits, confirmed by observers and sound operators, and they sank exactly 2 ships out of a convoy of 12. The torpedoes were striking targets or passing beneath them and exploding prematurely. The magnetic exploder was detonating the weapons before they reached optimal position beneath the target keels, or it was detonating them on magnetic anomalies that had nothing to do with Japanese ships. Commander Cromwell survived that attack, but died later in 1943, choosing to go down with his submarine rather than risk revealing intelligence secrets under Japanese interrogation. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously, but his June convoy attack became the final evidence that convinced even the Bureau's defenders that the magnetic exploder couldn't be fixed in combat conditions. The fundamental problem was that you couldn't calibrate magnetic sensors for every possible magnetic field variation in the Pacific. The Earth's magnetic field changed too much, too unpredictably. Even if you could calibrate for latitude, you couldn't account for local geological anomalies, or for the magnetic properties of the ocean bottom varying by depth and mineral content. The concept was sound in theory, but unworkable in practice across the vast ranges and varying environments where submarines operated. Admiral Lockwood made the decision that should have been made 2 years earlier. In late June 1943, he ordered all submarines under his command to deactivate the magnetic exploder. Torpedoes would run with contact exploders only. The Bureau of Ordnance protested. Lockwood ignored them. He had Vice Admiral Charles Nimitz's support, and Nimitz had the authority to overrule Washington when it came to operational decisions in his theater. The change was immediate and dramatic. Submarine commanders who'd been struggling with erratic torpedo performance suddenly found their weapons behaving predictably. They knew their torpedoes would run at the set depth. They knew they'd detonate on contact if they hit, and they could plan their attacks accordingly. The sophisticated magnetic exploder that was supposed to give American submarines a decisive advantage was abandoned in favor of a simple contact detonator that actually worked. By July 1943, American submarines in the Pacific were finally equipped with torpedoes that functioned reliably. The Mark 14 still wasn't perfect. There would be ongoing refinements throughout the war, but it had evolved from a catastrophic liability into an effective weapon. It had taken 21 months of war, countless failed attacks, lost opportunities, and submarine commanders risking their careers to fight their own bureaucracy. Now the Japanese were about to discover what effective American torpedoes could accomplish. USS Tang departed Pearl Harbor on September 8, 1943, under the command of Commander Richard O'Kane. O'Kane had been Morton's executive officer aboard Wahoo during its legendary patrols and had absorbed Morton's aggressive tactics. Tang was a new construction Balao-class submarine, purpose-built for Pacific operations with longer range, better habitability, and more torpedo storage than the older fleet boats. She carried 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, all with the depth correction, modified contact exploders, and magnetic exploders disabled. O'Kane's first patrol took Tang to the East China Sea, hunting Japanese shipping lanes between Japan, Korea, and occupied China. For 3 weeks, Tang stalked convoys with patient precision. O'Kane had learned from Morton's experience that the key to successful attacks was getting close. Inside 1,500 yards, where fire control solutions were simple and torpedo runtime was minimal, reducing the chance of targets maneuvering away. On October 10th, Tang found a 5-ship convoy escorted by 3 destroyers. O'Kane penetrated the destroyer screen by running at periscope depth between 2 escorts, a maneuver that required nerve and precise navigation. At 900 yards from the convoy, Tang fired 6 torpedoes in rapid succession. All 6 hit. 4 exploded, sinking 2 freighters and damaging a third so severely it would sink before rescue vessels arrived. The 5th torpedo struck but failed to detonate, a reminder that even modified exploders weren't perfect. The 6th exploded against a freighter's bow, blowing it completely off. 3 ships sunk or sinking from 6 torpedoes. The hit rate was 67%, the kill rate 50%. These were numbers American submarines had been unable to achieve consistently in the first 2 years of the war. Tang withdrew successfully, evaded counterattacks, and continued hunting. Over the next 3 weeks, Tang sank 4 more confirmed ships and damaged 2 others. O'Kane returned to Pearl Harbor having expended all 24 torpedoes and achieved results that matched or exceeded entire squadron's accomplishments during 1942. His patrol report didn't mention torpedo malfunctions or failures. The weapons simply worked. Tang's first patrol wasn't unique. Across the Pacific, submarines were reporting similar success rates. USS Harder, under Commander Samuel Dealey, sank 4 Japanese destroyers in one patrol in April 1944, a feat that would have been impossible with unreliable torpedoes. USS Flasher, under Commander George Grider, sank over 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping in 1944, making her the highest-scoring submarine by tonnage in the U.S. Navy. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, conducted surface gun actions and torpedo attacks that sank dozens of ships and even shelled Japanese shore installations. The pattern repeated across the submarine force. Commanders who'd been frustrated by weapon failures were now achieving consistent success. The tactics hadn't changed dramatically. American submarines were still using the same approach doctrines, the same fire control solutions, the same patrol areas. What had changed was that their primary weapon now functioned as designed. The Japanese had no effective counter to this transformation. Their anti-submarine warfare capabilities had been developed against the threat level, represented by submarines with defective torpedoes. Japanese convoy escort tactics assumed that submarines might get through the screens, but their attacks would probably fail due to weapon malfunction. Destroyers focused on preventing submarines from reaching attack positions rather than assuming that any submarine that achieved position would score kills. When American torpedoes suddenly became reliable, Japanese defensive doctrine became obsolete overnight. Convoys that had been adequately protected by 3 or 4 escort destroyers suddenly needed twice that number. Shipping routes that had been relatively safe needed to be abandoned or heavily reinforced. The underwater threat that Japan had managed to contain for 2 years suddenly became existential. From December 1941 through June 1943, American submarines in the Pacific fired approximately 4,300 torpedoes and sank approximately 180 Japanese ships. That's roughly 24 torpedoes per ship sunk, a rate that would be considered unacceptable in any conflict. The primary cause wasn't poor tactics or inadequate training. It was defective weapons. From July 1943 through August 1945, American submarines fired approximately 9,600 torpedoes and sank approximately 1,134 Japanese ships. That's roughly 8 torpedoes per ship sunk, 3 times more efficient than the war's first half. Add in the submarines operating from Australia and the West Coast during this period, and the total reaches 1,314 confirmed sinkings in those final 3 years. The arithmetic is brutal. With functioning torpedoes from the war's start, American submarines could have achieved in 1942 what they actually achieved in 1944. Japan's merchant marine would have been crippled a year earlier. The oil supplies from the Dutch East Indies that sustained Japan's war machine would have been cut off before Japan could build reserve stockpiles. The troop movements and reinforcement convoys that allowed Japan to consolidate its captured territories would have been interdicted. The war might have been shortened significantly. The tonnage statistics are even more revealing. American submarines sank 5,300,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping during the war. Roughly 4,400,000 tons of that total was sunk after July 1943. In the war's first 20 months, submarines accounted for roughly 900,000 tons. In the final 25 months, they destroyed nearly 5 times that amount. The difference was weapons that worked. Individual submarines' performance illustrates the transformation. USS Wahoo under Morton sank 20 ships during her 5 war patrols in 1942 and early 1943, an impressive record achieved despite torpedo problems through Morton's aggressive tactics. USS Tang under O'Kane sank 24 ships during 5 patrols from September 1943 through October 1944, all with reliable torpedoes that allowed precise execution of aggressive tactics without weapon failure undermining success. the Japanese merchant marine never recovered from the losses sustained after mid-1943. By late 1944, Japan had lost the majority of its tanker fleet, making it impossible to transport oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, even though Japan still controlled the oil fields. Without oil, the combined fleet couldn't sortie. Without merchant vessels, the army couldn't be supplied. Without transport capacity, captured territories couldn't be exploited. American submarines didn't win the Pacific War alone. Carrier aviation, strategic bombing, amphibious operations, and the grinding advance across the Pacific all contributed decisively to Japan's defeat. But the submarine campaign's effectiveness in strangling Japan's economy and logistics was central to the victory, and that campaign only became effective once American torpedoes worked properly. 52 American submarines were lost during World War II, taking approximately 3,700 men down with them. Not all those losses can be attributed to torpedo failures. Submarines are inherently dangerous, and combat makes them more so. But some submarines died because their torpedoes failed at critical moments. USS Wahoo was lost with all hands in October 1943, likely caught on the surface by Japanese aircraft after a torpedo attack. Morton had expended most of his torpedoes on attacks where some malfunctioned, leaving him with limited ammunition when Japanese escorts counterattacked. Would additional working torpedoes have allowed him to sink his targets faster and withdraw before aircraft arrived? Impossible to know, but possible to suspect. USS Harder was sunk in August 1944 after a legendary career in which Commander Dudley had become famous for his destroyer hunting tactics. Harder was attacked by Japanese escorts after sinking several ships in a convoy. She was lost because she'd expended her torpedoes and couldn't fight her way out of an extended counterattack. Earlier torpedo reliability might have altered the tactical situation that led to her loss. These are speculations, not certainties, but they represent the hidden cost of deploying defective weapons. Every torpedo that failed to explode was a missed opportunity to sink a target, escape pursuit, or maintain the initiative. Every failed attack extended patrol time in dangerous waters, gave Japanese forces additional chances to locate and destroy submarines. The Bureau of Ordnance's resistance to acknowledging torpedo problems didn't just reduce American submarines' effectiveness, it likely contributed to submarine losses that might have been avoided. The institutional failure extended beyond the immediate tactical consequences. The Mark 14's problems were entirely preventable. Proper testing with live warheads in realistic conditions would have revealed the depth control error, the contact exploder's mechanical limitations, and the magnetic exploder's sensitivity to field variations. But security classifications prevented such testing. Peacetime budget limitations discouraged extensive live-fire testing that consumed expensive torpedoes. The Bureau's confidence in mathematical models and limited trials substituted for empirical validation. This wasn't incompetence. It was institutional overconfidence, combined with peacetime procurement practices that prioritized cost control and security over combat validation. The Bureau's engineers genuinely believed their designs worked because their testing protocols said they worked. When combat revealed otherwise, institutional inertia and career concerns prevented rapid adaptation. Officers who'd spent decades developing the Mark 14 couldn't easily admit it was fundamentally flawed. Admitting failure would damage careers, programs, and budgets. But the cost of that institutional inertia was measured in missed opportunities, lost submarines, and a 21-month delay in unleashing American submarine warfare's full potential. When field commanders like Lockwood, Morton, and O'Kane finally forced the issue through unauthorized tests and bureaucratic persistence, the transformation was immediate. The weapons worked, the tactics succeeded, and Japanese shipping died by the hundreds. The Mark 14 torpedo controversy became a case study in military procurement and bureaucratic resistance to field feedback. After the war, the Navy conducted extensive reviews of what went wrong. The findings were diplomatically worded but clear. Inadequate testing, excessive classification, restricting validation, and institutional resistance to acknowledging problems had combined to deploy a defective weapon that undermined American submarine operations for nearly half the war. Those lessons influenced Cold War weapon development. Testing protocols were revised to require realistic combat conditions rather than idealized peacetime trials. Classification policies were adjusted to allow testing that might compromise some technical details but would validate basic functionality. Most importantly, procedures were established to give field commanders more authority to report problems and implement solutions without waiting for approval from procurement bureaucracies thousands of miles from combat zones. The Mark 14 itself was refined throughout the war and remained in service for years afterward. The post-war version, with all its problems solved, was an effective weapon. Ironically, Japanese submarines captured American Mark 14 torpedoes during the war and attempted to copy the design, recognizing that despite its initial problems, the basic concept was sound. Japanese copies never achieved American reliability, largely because they couldn't replicate the manufacturing precision required for the mechanical components. The submarine commanders who fought the torpedo battles learned lessons that extended beyond weapons. O'Kane survived the war, rescued after Tang was sunk by one of her own circular-running torpedoes in October 1944. He received the Medal of Honor and spent his post-war career writing about submarine tactics and the importance of aggressive leadership. His emphasis on closing to point-blank range, maintaining initiative, and trusting subordinates' judgment became foundational to American submarine doctrine. Morton died with Wahoo, but his tactical legacy survived in the commanders he'd trained and influenced. The aggressive, high-speed approaches on surface, the willingness to penetrate escort screens, the focus on devastating attacks rather than cautious preservation, all became standard practice. The submarine force that emerged from World War II was dramatically different from the one that entered it, and much of that transformation came from commanders who'd learned to fight effectively, despite having defective weapons. The 1,314 ships sunk between July 1943 and August 1945 represent what American submarines accomplished once they had working torpedoes. The number answers the question of whether American submarine tactics and commanders were effective. They were devastatingly effective once given weapons that functioned. But the larger question remains unanswered and probably unanswerable. How many ships could have been sunk if the torpedoes had worked from December 1941? How would the Pacific War's timeline have changed if Japan's merchant marine had been crippled in 1942 instead of 1944? Would Japan have been forced to sue for peace earlier if oil supplies had been cut off before reserves could be built? Would the atomic bombings have been necessary if conventional submarine warfare had strangled Japan's ability to fight? These questions matter because they illustrate the cost of institutional failure. The submarine commanders, crews, and torpedomen weren't responsible for the Mark 14's problems. They fought with the weapons they were given, adapted as much as they could, and eventually forced their own bureaucracy to acknowledge reality. But they fought the war's first 2 years with one hand tied behind their backs, and some of them died because their torpedoes failed at critical moments. The Japanese were right when they called American torpedoes defective. In fact, early in the war, they were more right than they even realized. The Mark 14 torpedo, America's primary submarine-launched weapon, was flawed in almost every way a torpedo could be flawed. Its depth control was inaccurate, causing it to run as much as 10 feet deeper than intended, often sliding harmlessly beneath its targets. Its magnetic exploder was so unreliable that it frequently detonated prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder, designed to trigger on impact, often crumpled instead of firing, meaning even a direct hit simply produced a dull thud against the enemy's hull. To top it off, in some cases, the weapon circled back and sank its own submarine. So when Japanese naval officers and engineers examined thud torpedoes recovered from shallow waters and declared them defective, they were not mocking, they were reporting accurate technical analysis. What they failed to anticipate was this. America did not need its weapons to work perfectly at first. It just needed to be able to fix them. That was the fundamental difference between the American and Japanese warfighting cultures, not in technology, not in intelligence, but in adaptability. The United States had the industrial depth, the bureaucratic flexibility, and most importantly, a command culture that allowed and sometimes even encouraged field modification, frontline testing, and even outright disobedience when lives depended on it. Japanese military culture could not imagine this. In Japan, deviation from design specifications was disloyalty. Questioning authority was insubordination. And solving critical engineering problems from the bottom up by captains instead of committees was simply unthinkable. But in the American submarine fleet, that was exactly what happened. Frustrated and desperate commanders began conducting unauthorized experiments. They fired torpedoes at cliffs, at harbor walls, at nets designed to catch them for inspection. They recorded depth errors. They disassembled exploders with metal files and hacksaws. They sent furious reports, sometimes bypassing entire command chains directly to the Bureau of Ordnance. Some even went so far as to deactivate the magnetic exploders entirely, relying only on mechanical impact detonations. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of survival. And eventually, the truth could no longer be denied, not even by the bureaucrats who had insisted that laboratory tests were sufficient, that combat data was unreliable, and worst of all, that the commanders must simply be aiming poorly. The truth was that the torpedo had been defective, but far more importantly, once its defects were acknowledged, America could fix them. And it did. Slowly at first, then rapidly, torpedoes were recalibrated, redesigned, and rebuilt. Depth regulators were corrected. The fragile magnetic exploder was removed. The contact pistol was redesigned with a new firing pin that triggered reliably at any angle. The entire device was structurally reinforced and tested repeatedly in real-world conditions. By late 1943, the torpedo that had been a national embarrassment had become a weapon of near-perfect reliability, and when it finally worked, it worked with devastating effectiveness. Over the next 3 years, American submarines sank 1,314 Japanese ships, not warships, though they did sink those too, but merchant vessels, tankers, transports, ammunition carriers, freighters filled with rice, coal, steel, copper, bauxite, soldiers, fuel, oil that never reached Japan, ammunition that never armed Japanese divisions, food that never fed Japanese civilians, reinforcements that never reached Pacific Islands, minerals that never became aircraft, tanks, or ships. The torpedo became not just a weapon of destruction but a weapon of deprivation. An island empire. It could produce courage, discipline, and tactical genius, but it could not produce oil. It could not produce rubber or aluminum in sufficient quantities. It could not power its factories without coal or fuel. Its islands could not feed its people, and its war machine could not feed itself. America discovered that it did not need to sink every Japanese warship to win. It only needed to sink every Japanese tanker. By 1944, the Pacific did not belong to either fleet, it belonged to American submarines. They hunted across vital shipping lanes like wolves, silently, methodically, waiting for convoys. They fired fewer torpedoes now, not because of shortages, but because they didn't need more. One torpedo. One hit, one explosion, one ship at the bottom, and another drop in Japan's industrial pulse. By late 1943, Japanese admirals were no longer mocking American torpedoes. They were begging for more escorts, begging for more detectors, begging for new factories to build ships faster than they were being sunk. But it was too late. Japan could still build ships, but it could not build the fuel to move them. Japan could still train pilots, but it could not deliver aviation gasoline to their airfields. Japan could still produce artillery shells, but it lacked the shipping to move them to battlefronts. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't dramatic. There were no enormous explosions, no decisive battlefield announcements. It was quieter, slower. It was strangulation. War is not always won by the biggest army or the best technology. Sometimes it is won by pressure. America applied pressure beneath the waves, systemic, mathematical pressure until Japan's maritime arteries collapsed. The empire did not fall because it ran out of courage. It fell because it ran out of fuel. One Japanese naval officer later said, "We lost the war because the sea became empty." But it hadn't become empty. It had become deadly. Merchant ships stopped sailing not because they were unavailable, but because they were afraid. Japanese captains began refusing assignments. Convoys became smaller. Journeys became slower. Desperation replaced confidence. Every voyage became a gamble. Every horizon became a threat. Every wake became a possible torpedo track. And every month, the numbers got worse. By 1945, 90% of Japan's pre-war merchant fleet was gone. Not trapped, not captured, gone, rusting in darkness at the bottom of the Pacific. From experts to admirals, Japan quietly stopped speaking of defective American torpedoes. They stopped speaking of torpedoes at all. They began speaking, instead, of hunger. The hunger of factories starved of resources, the hunger of fleets starved of fuel, the hunger of civilians facing shortages, rationing, and eventually, famine. The Mark 14 torpedo, which was once so unreliable that submarine commanders refused to use it, became the instrument that choked an empire. Japan had been right to mock it. What they failed to understand was that in American warfare, nothing stays broken for long. That is the difference between a weapon and a system. The Japanese believed in weapons, America believed in fixing them, and ultimately that belief is what sank an empire. Because in modern war, victory does not always belong to the nation that designs the best weapon. Sometimes, it belongs to the nation that learns the fastest how to make its bad weapons better. And that is why the Japanese stopped laughing in late 1943, because by then they had started sinking, one reliable torpedo explosion at a time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.